There are a lot of 1970s cars that have stuck in America's collective memory. The AMC Pacer, the Ford Mustang II, and the Porsche 914 are among those models with intriguing, if not always, happy stories. But those weren't the only significant and noteworthy cars from the 1970s, an era when hard times gave rise to funky rides, many of which history has mostly forgotten. Well folks, it's time for us to dredge the bottom of the proverbial lake and resurface forgotten 70s cars that deserve a different fate. Keep watching to see what we come up with. 1970 AMC Hornet. American Motors' smallest of what used to be known as the Big Four made some of the most memorable 1970s cars. Most of us know the Pacer, Gremlin, Javelin, and perhaps the Matador, but what about the Hornet? This funky-looking little sedan was, like many AMC products, ahead of its time. A useful compact that hit the market just as America realized big cars were no longer where it's at. What set the Hornet apart from its crummier competitors was the car's stubborn penchant for reincarnation. The AMC Hornet would be guised up and reborn as the 1978 Concorde, then mashed up with four-wheel drive Jeep parts to make the AMC Eagle. Itself, the 25 years too early forerunner of the modern crossover SUV. 1970 Ford Maverick. We're not sure why the Maverick hasn't gotten more love during the past 4 decades. This is the ultimate early 1970s car, a humble, cheapy sedan, the 1970s equivalent of a Nissan Sentra. And yet, look at that groovy styling. Because everything deserved a fastback in the 1970s, even the cheap-ass car you bought because you couldn't afford anything better. The car was a reliable runner, and yet somehow the car community has all but forgotten it. What a shame. 1972 Ford Torino. The Torino and its slightly nicer sibling, the Gran Torino, were Ford's intermediate cars, stalwart soldiers boldly doing battle with GM's handsome midsizers. They played many roles, from sporty muscular coupe, as seen in the hit TV show Starsky and Hutch, to wood-paneling family wagon, to sensible if anonymous sedan. As its Italian name implied, the Torino brought style to the masses, combining sinewy 1960s curves with blocky 1970s car presence. The Torino, as seen here, was made from 1972 until 1977, when it was unceremoniously replaced with the LTD2 and its snooty upscale aspirations. Muscle car versions of the Torino have attracted some collector interest, but the world at large seems to have forgotten how the Torino was a fixture of 1970s American car life. 1971 Volkswagen 411 and 412. Stoked with the Beetle's success, along with that of the bus and the flashback, Volkswagen decided it was time to bring a luxury car to the US. Except, VW's idea of a luxury car was a world away from that of the average Americans. Sure, the blunt-nosed 411 was among the most modern of cool-aired Volkswagens, with the McPherson strut front suspension from the Super Beetle, but equipping it with standard-fit metallic paint and wall-to-wall carpeting was still not enough to transform it into a Cadillac competitor. Volkswagen was right about one American luxury expectation, the standard-fit automatic transmission. But as it was coupled to an 80-horsepower Volksboxer, the 411 couldn't muster the acceleration Americans expected from a luxury car, or from a ride-on mower for that matter. Volkswagen gave up selling the Type 4 to Americans in 1974, and its next attempt at a luxury car, the Phaeton, wouldn't fare much better 30 years later. 1973 Pontiac Asry. Everyone remembers the rolling disaster that was the Chevrolet Vega, but few remember GM's first foray into badge engineering, the Pontiacized version. At the same time Chevy was birthing the disastrous Vega, Pontiac was working on its own small car, which, like Chevy's homegrown Smallster, was punted by the corporate designed Vega. And if that wasn't bad enough, the brand had a barely disguised version forced onto it in the form of the Pontiac Asry. GM had ironed out most of the Vega's problems by 1973, but the Asry was too expensive and too thinly disguised, and it was never a big seller. 1973 Oldsmobile Omega. Ever wonder why people didn't get too upset about badge engineering products when the idea first reared its ugly head? Because in the beginning, it wasn't always awful. Take the Omega, Oldsmobile's version of the commonest housefly's Chevrolet Nova. It was pleasant enough, a solid and reliable 1970s car, and differed enough from the Nova to hold its own head, lights, up high. The same can be said for Buick's version, the also forgotten Apollo. In the 1970s, the horrific dark side of badge engineering was still in the future, though it would be realized soon enough at Oldsmobile when the Omega moved to the ill-fated front-wheel drive X-body platform. 1975 Ford Granada. Fashion-wise, the 1970s were a bit stuffy. Unless you were one of those radical Californians, you were expected to still wear a business suit to work, though you might loosen things up a bit with shaggy hair grown over the ears, you hippie, or a white tie. To us, the Ford Granada reflects those fashions of the day, upright and formal and not entirely comfortable with itself. Ford advertisements compared the Granada to the Mercedes-Benz 280, first sparingly, then gratuitously. And while it seems laughable today, the 1970s public must have bought it, because it bought a lot of Granadas. Ford sold nearly 1.8 million examples between 1975 and 1980, and we're not even counting the look-alike Mercury Monarch. 1977 Datsun 200SX. Most people recall Japanese automakers taking over the American market in the 1980s, but not everyone realizes that they had their share of stumbles with their own 1970s cars. One of those was the Datsun's, now Nissan, alleged sports coupe, the 200SX, arguably one of the ugliest cars of the 1970s. At the time, the Japanese were known for their economy cars and, to a lesser extent, for sports cars. But the 200SX was neither. It was pokey and clumsy, and while Datsun touted the superior fuel economy of its B210, the 200SX had an obvious drinking problem. The few 200SXs Datsun managed to sell were soon consumed by rust, and before long the 200SX was forgotten like a bad dream. But the failed 200SX did inspire Datsun to do better. It launched a new 200SX for 1980 that would become an oft-overlooked classic. 1975 Mercury Bobcat. Badge engineered was still in its infancy in 1975 when Ford delivered a gussied-up Pinto in the form of the Mercury Bobcat. Ford stylists made some effort to differentiate the Bobcat's front end with a formal, upright grille and a boxier hood, but the back end always makes us chuckle. To differentiate the Bobcat from the Pinto, Ford took an extra set of Pinto taillights and glued the left one inboard of the right taillight, and vice versa. A move we're pretty sure fooled almost no one. In fact, we know it didn't. From 1975 to 1980, Ford sold 1.3 million Pintos, while Mercury couldn't even move 225,000 Bobcats. 1978 Buick Century Oldsmobile Cutless Aeroback. America's obsession with Europe was taking firm hold in the late 1970s, so when GM downsized its intermediate models for 1978, it decided the cars needed a Euro-style hatchback profile. The result of this wisdom was the 2- and 4-door Aeroback body style applied to the Buick Century and Oldsmobile Cutless. While Chevy and Pontiac Intermediates got a traditional notchback sedan, GM didn't think Buick and Oldsmobile needed them. Wrong. The failure of these two almost hatchbacks took GM by surprise, and it took the company 2 years to get a proper sedan in production. How much did the 1970s car-buying public hate the Aerobacks? Well, between 1978 and 1979, Buick sold fewer than 48,000 Century Fastbacks. When the sedan arrived in 1980, Buick sold 130,000. 1978 Ford Fairmont. Another sign of America's budding Euro obsession was the Ford's Granada replacement, the Fairmont, which took simplification to a new level. Stripped of all formal adornment, the Fairmont was a brown paper bag of a sedan, simple and functional and honest, and a refreshing change from the oversized, overchromed barges that constituted most of the Ford lineup throughout the 1970s. The two-door version, called Fairmont Futura, was actually kind of a cool-looking car in an oddball way. The Fairmont has been largely forgotten, but we all know the Fox platform on which it was based, as it would go forward to underpin the Mustang for the next quarter century. 1978 Dodge Magnum. No, not that Dodge Magnum. This Dodge Magnum was Chrysler's attempt at a modern, personal luxury car to take on the sharply creased and sharp-looking Ford Thunderbird of the late 1970s. If nothing else, you have to love it for its clean headlight covers, which flip down when the lights were switched on. See them in action in this old film. Ironically, the then new Magnum was made from Stone Age parts. It was based on a mid-size platform first developed in the early 1960s, and it was one of the last Chrysler passenger cars to offer a big block engine, in this case the 400 cubic inch, 6.6 liter, outgrowth of the legendary 383. Chrysler was in dire straits with little money for advertising, and with fuel prices spiking, few people had interest in an expansive, 2-ton, V8-powered coupe. The Magnum sold poorly, as did its also forgotten 1980s follow-up, the Dodge Mirada.